We have three speakers today, Victoria Tuffle, Ben Collier and John Ginn. I will leave it to them to introduce themselves because they will do it far better than I, and they've got a voice and blushing. Hopefully what you will get from today is a level of understanding of some of the spicier rumours that have been going around about GDPR and the disaster that may entail from there, and a positive mindset to come out from this, looking at the opportunities that this is going to present for everybody. So, with no further ado, very welcome, Victoria.
Hello everybody, I'm Victoria Tuffle. I'm Managing Director of a company called Data Compliant, and we kind of do what it says on the tin and help people stay compliant with data protection. So what I'm really going to talk about today is a brief summary of GDPR and how it affects everybody and the sorts of things that you need to be thinking about, and also that there is an opportunity, as Ben just said. So, Matt just said, sorry. We'll leave it. Ben would also say that. And so we also look a little bit about the opportunities as well. So we're just going to, the contents, very quick summary. GDPR is a new data protection landscape, so I'm going to touch on what's going to change. What do you need to know as people who work in organisations that process personal data? What do you need to do? And what is it? So it's the General Data Protection Regulation, and it's been designed really to strengthen individuals' rights, because there's an absolute fact that businesses have really had opportunities to work with people's data in a way that individuals don't understand and wouldn't necessarily buy into. And the Data Protection Act was invented, for want of a better term, before we had things like the internet, before we had social media, before we communicated in the way that we do now. And there were some people that were doing some terrible things with data, and frankly the enforcement wasn't so great. And the idea of the General Data Protection Regulation is that those rights will go back to the individual. The scope of the legislation is completely broadened, so it doesn't matter where you are in the world. If you're processing data of European citizens, you must comply with GDPR. It does increase compliance obligations, and I will talk a little bit about how that works in a minute. And obviously, I'm sure you've all heard about all the enforcement powers and how they've increased, and I will touch on that as well. And the other thing it is meant to do is provide uniformity across the EU, and that's important because we live in a digital environment. We are just an island, obviously. At the moment, we're part of the EU. Yes, we're going to Brexit, but we're still going to want to deal and trade digitally across Europe, in fact, globally. So one of the most important things about GDPR is having the right data governance. And actually the buck stops with the board, and I think that's one of the things that is really important about GDPR. If the people at the top of the organisation, whether they be the board, whether they be trustees, whoever they might be, don't buy into it, aren't asking proper questions about what do you need to do to be compliant with GDPR, what happens if there's a breach, what's the impact on our business, and frankly worrying about whether or not they're going to be in a job if they don't get it right, then there is no chance of GDPR becoming embedded throughout the business. So that whole issue of governance is really critical, and I will talk about that in a minute as well. So, what's going to change in GDPR compared to what we currently have in the Data Protection Act? And I think this is one of the most important things, is that there is a Data Protection Act. It's been in place for a very long time. And actually, if organisations have been bothering to comply with the Data Protection Act, their journey to being compliant with GDPR is going to be much smoother than people who are coming at it from fresh, who simply haven't bothered, who've just taken advantage of all the loopholes. So under GDPR, personal data definition has been expanded. So all the old favourites are there. All the buying habits, name, address, communication methods, jobs, all of that stuff is still personal data. But identification number, whether that be a membership number or a customer number or a national insurance number, if that can be tracked back to an individual and identify that individual, it is personal data. Location data, similarly. Genetic data and economic data are considered personal data. Cultural or social identity, and more worrying for most than many of the other things is the online identifiers, because if you are using an IP address that can be linked back to an individual rather than a machine that might have multiple users, that is considered personal data, and that has big impact on digital advertisers. Similarly, cookies that are linked to an individual. So, as well as the basic personal data definitions, there have been some increases to sensitive personal data definitions, which now include biometric data and genetic data, where that data is used to identify an individual. So things like if you're using routinely in your business fingerprint recognition on your computers and tablets, that is personal data. And data concerning a person's sex life, which was actually considered to be sensitive personal data under the Data Protection Act, but sexual orientation has now been defined specifically. There are so many myths flying around about GDPR at the moment, and I could spend probably a day just going through every single one and shooting it down. This is one of the biggest ones, which is you have to have explicit consent for all data processing for all purposes, and it's simply not true. There are actually 6 grounds for processing. Consent is definitely one of them, and I will talk about what that means and some of the hoops you have to jump through to get consent. Performance of a contract, so in a retail world, if you are sending somebody a pair of trousers that they've ordered from you, that's fulfillment of a contract. You don't need consent to that. They've placed an order, you're sending out that order. Compliance with legal obligations, and there are legal obligations in every organisation, you still have to be able to comply with those. Necessary to protect vital interests, probably unlikely to impact anyone here. It's basically kind of life and death stuff, health data, that sort of thing. Performance of a task in the public interest, and purpose of legitimate interests. And I think for the people in the room, the 3 that are most relevant are consent, performance of a contract, and legitimate interest. So I'll spend a little bit of time on those in a minute. As well as 6 grounds for processing, though, there are 6 principles of GDPR which apply to any data processing that you do and which have to be applied to any data processing you do. And for the avoidance of doubt, just storing data somewhere is data processing. Okay? That's where it starts. And then everything else that you do that's clever with the data is also data processing. So transparency, the data has to be processed lawfully, fairly, and transparently, and I'll talk about what that means in a minute. There is a purpose limitation. You have to specify the purpose, and you have to tell the individual the purpose or purposes for which you're collecting their data. And once you've done that, you can, and you have to do that as you're collecting the data, in fact, technically just before you collect the data. And once you've done that, although you can continue to process the data for that purpose and linked purposes, you may not process it further in a manner that is incompatible with that original purpose. So you can't just change the rules halfway through and go and do something else. Data minimization, this was in the DPA and it's still in the GDPR. Adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary. In other words, we're going back to you have to define a purpose. You can't just take data because it might be useful one day. You have to know what you're collecting it for, because if you don't know what you're collecting it for, you can't tell the individual what you're collecting it for. One of the words that always gets forgotten in here is adequate. If you don't have enough data to do what you need to do with it, that's equally bad. You've got to have enough, but you can't have too much. Accuracy, you are obliged to keep it accurate and up to date. There's nothing new there. It was one of the DPA principles as well. Storage limitations. So this is all about when you've done what you need to do with that data, what kind of retention policies and deletion policies you're going to have in place. If you want to use it 10 years down the line for analytics purposes or for profiling or for whatever, as long as it's still relevant, obviously you can do so, but you are expected to take appropriate steps as far as pseudonymizing or anonymizing that data is, so that it is not routinely personal data that you're using for those analytics purposes. And then integrity and confidentiality, and that used to just be the security principle under the Data Protection Act. It hasn't changed much. It's not just about technical measures, about making sure that it's not just about cybersecurity. It's about organizational and operational measures. It's about making sure you have the right access controls in place. It's about making sure that people in your organization know what they are expected to do and how they are expected to protect other people's data that you are responsible for. So having established the grounds and having established what the principles are, what do we have to worry about when collecting personal data? And the simple answer is there are no more murky waters. You can't obfuscate with what you're going to do with the data. You have to tell them. So no more murky waters and no more camouflaged intentions. We live in a world where transparency is not only key, but it's mandated under GDPR. So you have to play fair. You have to be honest. You have to tell them what you're doing with their data. To be honest, if you are doing something with their data that you don't want to tell them, in my view, you probably shouldn't be doing it. Because if you don't want to tell them what you're doing, you have to ask yourself why that is. And by being honest and fair and by explaining things very simply and very clearly, and when I say simple and clear, I think it's probably worth mentioning that the average reading age of a UK citizen is now that of a 9-year-old. Okay, that's how simple and clear you've got to keep it. But that will engender trust, give your customers a great experience and you a competitive edge, and basically enhance your brand reputation. So when you're collecting data, what do you need to be mindful of? Well, you've got to tell them what you're doing with the data. That's a given. And a good route to do that is through your privacy notice, which typically would be on a website. And you have to provide specific types of information within that privacy notice. So obviously company name. If you have a DPO, and you might need to have a DPO if you fall under certain criteria mandated by GDPR, then you have to put the name of your DPO in your privacy notice, and you have to tell them how to contact their DPO. You have to tell the people whose data you're processing who's going to receive the data. And that's quite arduous in the sense that, yes, it's processors who are going to do the certain things with that data, but also if you're going to share it with third-party companies, you have to list them. Categories at the moment are not considered to be good enough, and you have to tell them everybody who's going to receive the data and why. And actually telling them why is always helpful because at least they can understand why you're doing what you're doing. You have to tell them if you're going to transfer the data outside the EEA. You don't have to get consent for that, but if you don't get consent for it, you are responsible for making sure that wherever you're transferring it is safe. And there are various ways of doing that, but through contracts and binding clauses and so on. That's where Safe Harbor comes in, or used to be Safe Harbor, now Privacy Shield for US transfers where US companies have signed up to it, and the EU has currently said that that's adequate. Whether that will stay the case is unknown, it's under discussion at the moment, but for the moment it's all we've got, so nobody's going to give you a hard time for going down that route. You have to tell them how long you're going to store the data, and if you don't know how long you're going to store the data, you have to give them a clue as to what you're doing with it and therefore how long you might need to. You have to explain what the grounds for processing are, and if you're using legitimate interest, and we'll talk about legitimate interest because it's pretty critical in GDPR, you have to explain the legal grounds by which you have determined that it is legitimate interest. And if it's consent-based, then you have to tell them that they can withdraw their consent at any time. That has to be in privacy notice as well. You have to tell them what their rights are, and they've got some enhanced rights, and I will talk about that in a minute. You have to tell them whether their data is being used in automated processing, such as profiling, because profiling is now considered automated processing. And you have to tell them if it's going to be used for any purpose other than that you specified at the time you collected the data. So that's the privacy notice. Legitimate interest, I think, is a very interesting grounds for processing under GDPR in particular. It existed under the Data Protection Act as well. It's what all the sort of opt-outs were all about, all based on legal interest. And the GDPR does state specifically that direct marketing may be a legitimate interest. It only says maybe, it doesn't say it is. And there are some conditions. So if you're using legitimate interest as the grounds for processing the data, you have to be doing something that the consumer would reasonably expect you to do with their data based on what they're expecting from you and what you've told them. Postal mailings and manual phone calls may very well fall under legitimate interest, as long as you give the right to unsubscribe or opt out at the point of data collection, and as long as you check that they're not on NPS, TPS, CTPS, any of those kind of Robinson lists. There will be further guidance. There's already some guidance, which I think Ben is going to talk about in a minute, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But it's worth noting that any sensitive personal data, so if you sell chocolates and there might be nuts in it and you collect nut allergy data, that has to be processed under an explicit consent of the individual. You can't use legitimate interest. Because we're talking about direct mail and because we're talking about legitimate interest, there was a bit of research carried out by the Royal Mail some time ago, which I thought was really interesting. And direct mail actually has some real advantages. It's a physical channel, it's tangible, it's not overused, and basically the Royal Mail set up a study which monitored brain reactions to physical and virtual images, ads, direct mail packs, virtual ads. And they found that actually tangible materials, something you can touch and feel, left a bigger imprint in the brain. God knows how these things work. I'm always amazed at how they can measure these things. That there's more emotional processing involved, where you're actually touching, feeling, opening, looking, reviewing, all of that sort of thing. And that's very important for the brand because it's sort of memory and association. And also there is more kind of internal feelings. So, you're actually taking in more of what the ads say. So I just wanted to give direct mail a quick plug now because I really like direct mail. And it works very nicely for the legitimate interest. But if you are going to use legitimate interests as the grounds under which you're going to process data, you first of all need to conduct a legitimate interest assessment. And there are really 4 stages to this. The first is to look at what is the purpose for processing and why is that purpose important to your business. So what is the legitimate interest to your business of processing that data? What parties are involved? Is it a means of sharing data with third parties? Is it just something that you as an organisation want to do? And having established that purpose, you then have to determine the necessity for that process. And the word necessary is very important. Is it necessary so that you as an organisation can actually achieve your goals? And it's just worth noting that words like useful, desirable, they don't work. They're not necessary. They're something that it's nice to have. It actually has to be necessary to fall under the legitimate interest grounds. So legitimate interest, having established those things, the next stage is to conduct a balancing test because businesses' interests are not allowed to override the rights of the individuals. So you need to look at what is the nature of the interest of the business, and is it within the reasonable expectations of the individual? Are you going to be using data that might need greater protection, for example, children's data? What is the impact of the processing? Is it in the interest of the individual? And actually, is there added value or convenience by what you're doing? Is there any harm in the process? And if there is it actually warranted? So let's take credit scores as an example. They don't get a credit card or they don't get a mortgage. That's probably harmful, but it's probably perfectly warranted. Do you have necessary safeguards in place? So again, we're talking about bog standard, looking after the data, making sure that you're only collecting the data that you need, making sure that you're only keeping it for as long as you need it, and making sure that you have appropriate security measures throughout the organisation to protect that data. And then the 4th stage is all about documenting and reviewing the whole legitimate interest assessment piece, because under GDPR there's a new principle of accountability. And that requires you to document and record every decision that you take in relation to processing personal data. The accountability principle basically exists to make sure that you as an organisation can demonstrate that you are complying with GDPR 6 principles. So you need good governance, excellent record keeping, and documentary evidence in relation to all processing. So everything that you are doing is about documented evidence. You have to have that now under GDPR, whereas before you didn't need it in the same way. I thought it'd be useful just to have a couple of examples of legitimate interest. So here's an organisation. I want to take consumer data. I want to sell it to multiple third parties. That's what my business does. I make my money that way. My privacy notice says that I'm going to take their data and I'm going to sell it to multiple third parties. It's pretty generic. There is an opt-out notice, but I'm going down the legitimate interest route. And the outcome is that the customer will receive large volumes of marketing material and from multiple unspecified companies. And to be honest, I think in that case, the business needs far outweigh the individual's rights. And these are these are very general, so don't for God's sake say, oh, you can never do that. But in my world, that would probably not fit the bill. There might be some things you can do to make it fit the bill, to add value back to the customer. But on that example, I would say that doesn't fall under legitimate interest. On the other hand, I want to take consumer data. I want to pass it to selected third parties so that I can make relevant offers to make my marketing more effective. The privacy policy it clearly defines what you can do, and I would always suggest that you include the benefits with the opt-out, but certainly the benefits, because that gives you better buy-in and explains to your individuals and builds the trust and enhances your brand. And the outcome is they get relevant offers based on any profiling and analytics that can be carried out by third parties. And in that case, that seems pretty fair to me, and you would probably get away with legitimate interest under that kind of example. So that's legitimate interest. Then, of course, we have the thorny issue of consent, and consent is tricky because consent has to be freely given. So for HR, for example, and probably none of you are from HR, but for HR, it's very difficult to get consent to some of the things you might want to do to your employees, because they rely on you to give them a job. So to what extent is that freely given? So it has to be freely given. It has to be specific, and that's basically about granular. Yes, you can email me. Yes, you can phone me, but I don't ever want direct mail, or vice versa. It has to be informed, and that's what we've been talking about, the privacy notice. What are you going to do with it? What am I actually consenting to? And it has to be completely unambiguous. And that means that any consent that you get needs clear affirmative action. And without that clear affirmative action, you don't have consent. So pre-tick boxes are not acceptable. There's no affirmative action happening there at all. You've ticked it. The only affirmative, it's a negative action, would be to untick it. So that's no good. Silence is a nothing. It's certainly not consent. Inactivity, similarly, you're not doing anything to say I consent, so that's no good. And very generic terms if you're relying on consent as the grounds for processing. So terms like, are you happy to receive marketing from selected third parties on a consent basis would be unacceptable. Consent can be withdrawn at any time, and you have to stop what you're doing, and you have to tell the customer that upfront on your privacy notice. If you're processing sensitive personal data, consent must be explicit. And you, as organisations, have to be able to demonstrate that consent was given. And that can be tough because consent is dynamic. You might get consent, they might withdraw consent. You need basically the dates of when they consented, the dates of when they withdrew it. And if they then come back and say, actually, you can mark it, you need that data. So you need to keep a record of how and when they're consenting. You need to keep a record of what they're consenting to, what the language was at the time they consented, and so on. So trickier waters than we've had in the past for consent. Sorry, I forgot to click. Okay. Profiling is another area of interest because for the first time, profiling now falls under automated processing. And individuals have the right not to be subject to a decision when it's based on automated processing, and if it produces a legal effect or similarly significant effect on the individual. And in marketing world, a legal or similarly significant effect is unlikely to materialize for many organizations, and there will always be exceptions. So for marketing, profiling may not require consent for profiling. So organisations have to make sure that individuals are able to get hold of human intervention if they require it, that they can express their point of view, and that they can obtain an explanation of the decision, and if they wish to challenge it. And that can be as simple as, I don't like what you've done to me. I'm going to use HR as an example. You fill out your CV, you send it to a company, it goes through some kind of algorithm, it gets spit back in about a split second. Nobody's seen it. A piece of machinery has decided that you are not employable. You can then go to the company to whom you try to send the CV and say, I want someone to look at it. That doesn't mean that the person who looks at it has to say, yes, I will interview you. It just means they have the right for somebody to look at it and go, I've looked at it, we still don't want to interview you, or I've looked at it, the algorithm's wrong, get in here immediately, because I think we might need you. So under GDPR, profiling is any form of automated processing of personal data. So it looks at personal aspects relating to an individual, and particularly in relation to personal preferences, your interests, where you are, your economic situation, your reliability, your behaviour, whether you're buying things or not buying things, or how you perform at work. Because GDPR is industry-wide. I mean, it's enterprise-wide. It's not just about marketing. It's about every area of the business. About health. So any automated segmentation, such as just bog standard recency, frequency, and monetary value that we've been doing for God knows how many decades, is profiling. The Information Commissioner's Office wrote some guidance on profiling back in March, a consultation document. We now have Working Party 29 guidance for the European guidance. We don't have ICO guidance yet. But what's interesting is that there are clearly identified benefits and risks that WP29 and the ICO feel need to be considered when profiling. So yes, sure, better market segmentation, but actually, are you in any way infringing the fundamental rights of the individual whose data you're processing? Profiling. It permits analysis of risk and fraud. And is that not a good thing? Yes, it is. But if you're looking at it on the basis of marketing profiling, are you going to have a risk of skew? So let's say I'm not on Facebook, but you're using Facebook to determine what sorts of offers you should make to people. I might get missed out because I'm not a social media user. And that kind of skew and discrimination is something that the Information Commissioner is keen to avoid. There's an ability to adapt and align offers of goods, services and prices with the individual's demand, and that is absolutely perceived by everybody to be a good thing. But unjustifiable deprivation of services or goods based on that profiling, and particularly if that profiling is based on data that's inaccurate or out of date, is not considered a good thing. It can create decision-making consistency. They're very keen to avoid the data broking industry using information for commercial gain without really the knowledge or understanding of the individuals who are providing that data. So there are some considerations if you are using profiling that really do need to be considered. Relevance. So it has to be relevant to what is strictly needed to meet the purpose, and you have to identify that purpose prior to collecting the data. In other words, it has to be purpose-driven. It has to be accurate, so if you're generating new data and new profiles based on data relating to other people, so internet and social media users, you can't make decisions on inaccurate data, so you need to put in place robust procedures to protect that accuracy and quality of the data. And that means routine testing. Just make sure your algorithms still work, make sure your systems are still fair and unbiased. And retention, and actually there's no specific guidance on retention periods for profiling, but profiles are dynamic, they do evolve. So again, it's back to regular reviews to make sure they're relevant for the purpose that you're using them. And actually a privacy by design approach, and I'll talk about that in a sec, to compliance and making sure that the whole organisation is aware of privacy awareness is a key to this whole issue. So one of the key things that I think a lot of people are talking about at the moment is whether or not to share their data, whether they're allowed to share their data, how and when they might be allowed to share their data with other parties. And basically, if it can provide benefits both to the organisation and to the individual, so you get extra insights because you've got multiple data sources and you're all doing some profiling and analytics and making sure that people get relevant offers, you get more cost-efficient marketing, and the consumer gets things that are of in theory at least, things that are of interest to them. Now it would be good if you're going to do it so that you've got time to ensure you're compliant in May. There are some steps in the process. If you can demonstrate legitimate interest, you can do it on an opt-out basis, but you have to tell the individual very clearly that you're sharing their data. It's always helpful to tell them what the benefits are to them, because then they can buy into it and understand it. I think it's worth noting the ICO did some research where they found that 20% of individuals do not trust the organisations with whom they're sharing data. And that lack of trust manifests particularly in private companies and social media platforms. They're more inclined, and I find this extraordinary, to trust the government and public organisations, whereas if you look at the government and its track record of protecting personal data, it's pretty poor, but nonetheless, and it's actually the older people who are less likely to trust. So it's just interesting research that tells you how far away we are from where we need to be in terms of making people trust what you're doing. Make sure, if you're going to share data, that you have a robust data sharing agreement in place, and there are mandated clauses that have to be in there that make sure that the persons or personal persons with whom you're sharing that data will look after it, have retention and deletion policies, that you have the right to audit, and that they have appropriate security measures. And make sure, transfer is one of the riskiest sort of places of data breach, so make sure your transfer methods are secure, and I think I just talked about security, and I talked about retention and deletion. The existing rights are largely unchanged, but they do have some new rights. They've always had the right to demand to see all the data you hold on them. Organisations have been allowed to charge, generally speaking, £10 for such a request, but now there is no charge. And there is research that's showing that individuals are actually waiting for May so that they can actually flood everybody with subject access requests so that they can know who's holding what. So organisations really have to be ready for this and have to have systems in place that allow them to do it in a way that's efficient and kind of as little cost as possible. And the other problem is you used to have 40 days, now you've got 30. They also have right to sort of demand correction of inaccurate data. I don't know to what extent right to portability will affect people in the room, but if I have a mobile telephone contract with EE and I want to move it to Vodafone, I'm not sure I'd want all my data to go to Vodafone, but if I did, I can ask EE to provide it in a commonly used machine-readable format, and then that can be transferred to the other provider. But I'm sure you've all heard about the right to be forgotten. If you receive a request for right to be forgotten, but you have a genuine need to keep that data for a purpose, and you can demonstrate that need and prove that need, you don't have to delete the data. But if you can't, you do. They have the right to withdraw consent at any time at no charge. They have the right to complain to the Information Commissioner's Office. Well, I don't think there's anything new about that. And they have the right to object to profiling, including most forms of tracking and profiling related to direct marketing. And that is, that's if you're not relying on consent. That's only if it's legitimate interest. And the burden is on the organisation, the controller, to demonstrate compelling grounds for processing if you want to continue to do it, or have to continue to do it. Regardless of how far along the journey you are, it can all go horribly wrong. So what happens if it does? And actually one of the most important things that I think people tend to forget about, there's a lot of waffle about fines and so on and so forth, but reputational damage is huge. And yes, sure, on the GDPR there are now significant financial penalties. But so much is spoken about 20 million euros and 4% of global turnover. But actually, for a first breach where you're an individual or you're a small organisation and it was non-intentional, you could very easily just get away with a written warning and a bit of advice from the ICO, because they do advise that they're not just there to kind of beat everybody up and fine them millions of pounds. Another myth actually is that they're going to fine everybody because they need lots of money to fund themselves. Well, the money goes to the Treasury, it doesn't go to the ICO, so that's another myth that needs to be shot in the head. But it does go to much more significant penalties. So if you don't bother to establish evidence for legal grounds for processing, if you don't bother to comply with profiling or data subject rights and other things, then that is where the maximum fines come into play. And there's a kind of tiered structure, things in the middle where it's like 10 million euro and so on. But that's the least and the worst. And sorry, I think I got the clipping wrong there. There you go. So there are a few things you could do right now to get ready for GDPR. And I said at the very beginning, governance is absolutely critical. So I think within the organisation, you need to establish roles and responsibilities. And again, I'm not just talking about marketing, I'm talking about throughout the organisation, every area of it. If you need to appoint a data protection officer, and it's mandatory under GDPR in certain circumstances, you need to do that evaluation and appoint one and be ready for it. You need to get everybody in your organisation trained in data protection. Something like, and it depends which piece of research you read, but somewhere between 50 and 80% of data breaches are caused by inadvertent human error. In other words, people don't know what they are meant to be doing with personal data, they're not trained, they make mistakes. Review the data security standards you currently have in place. But actually, for me, the first thing is, if you don't know what you've got in terms of personal data, you haven't got a cat's hope in hell of actually being compliant with GDPR. So the first step in the process, once you've got the governance and you've got the buy-in from the top and you've got everybody organised with their roles and responsibility, is to look at your personal data and list those assets. And you need to look at where it comes from. Where's your data coming from? Have you got 56 sources of data coming in, or have you got thousands? It is terrifying how many people don't know the answer to that question. Where's it held? Is it held in the cloud? Is it held in your Outlook files where you've been sending emails about people and things and sending Excel spreadsheets, God help us, unpassword protected through your network? How do you use it? Who can access it? How can they access it? How do you transfer it? To whom do you transfer it? How many data processors do you have? Does somebody look after payroll? What do you have in place with them to define where it can then go on or cannot then go on? What is your retention and deletion policy, and those people to whom you are transferring that data? And all of those, that has to be done first, because if you can't map the data that's coming into being used within and going out of your business, you don't know enough to be able to be compliant. If you are using data processors or sharing data, you need to review and document the legal basis for processing. So for every field of data that you collect, you need to demonstrate that you have a purpose for doing so and a legal basis for processing it, based on those 6 I showed you earlier. The principle of accountability is huge, and it isn't only about what you do, it is very much about what you don't do. So look at your data processing activity, make sure you document for evidence, and review your contracts. Look at every contract that you have with anybody that you're working with in terms of data processing, whether you're sharing data or processing it. You have a data sharing agreement, you can have a data processing agreement, but whatever you have to have something in place that is robust and enforceable. Review your policies and procedures. So make sure that everything you're doing reflects the rights, the new rights that weren't in place before of individuals. Make sure that you are fit to meet subject access request timetables and be ready for a bit of a flood. Look at and review your information security management system, and if you don't have one, you really do need one. And if you do have one, you're still going to have to update it. So that's a given. And finally, embrace privacy by design. DPIA's data protection privacy impact assessments are mandated now. They were always best practice under Data Protection Act. Now they're mandated. You have to run one if you're using new tech or collecting new data or a different purpose that might have risks to the individuals concerned. And then you have to identify those risks and have a risk mitigation plan. So that really was my 7 things. And actually, at the end of it, we go back to this whole thing. Well, but there's an opportunity. You can save money as a business because you're going to be more efficient and more organised in the way you process your data. You can build an honest and fair relationship with your customers so that 20% who don't trust everybody now actually becomes, you get a competitive advantage because you're finding that they do trust you because you're playing fair with them. And you're giving them a great customer experience, and that gives you a competitive advantage, and it gives you a real means of enhancing brand reputation. Thank you very much.